Hey everyone, hope that you are enjoying your break. We are going to talk about Rebecca. I want to record some videos to make sure that we are understanding each chapter and following along. This would be really good to listen to after you read the chapter to make sure that you've understood a lot of the themes, the plot development, some of the characters. I'm going to go through the book and show you some things that I'm highlighting, some important points, and try to fuel a little bit of intellectual thought and discussion fodder, if you will. So in chapter 5, we saw kind of the love story begin. We saw the conversation between De Winter and the narrator in the car. We saw kind of the first pangs of new love. We saw that the narrator mentioned new love as a fever, something that a single look can ruin everything. One word that's said wrong can sow a lot of doubt and make somebody crazy almost. And we saw that a little bit. And with our narrator, the big climactic ending to the chapter, and there's always a really important ending to the chapter, there's always an important sentence or phrase, was I got to call him Maxim. And this was a huge hint of the theme of jealousy that is beginning to develop. There obviously is another woman that the narrator is contending with, but we also know that that woman is dead. So our narrator is jealous of somebody who no longer exists, if you will, which is a little bit haunting, and it really adds to the Gothic conventions that we are studying throughout this unit. So let's dive into chapter 6. Chapter 6 is a continuation of this love story. We're going to see the rise here. We're going to understand what happened after that car ride. We know that it left off pretty awkward. We don't know whether or not the narrator is ever going to see De Winter again. She's probably really embarrassed about how that car ride went. We know that she's very introspective. She's probably spent the last 24 hours replaying everything that happened in the car over and over and over and over and over again. So we also learned at the end of chapter 5 that, was that chapter 5 or was this chapter 6? Nope. At the beginning of chapter 6, we learned that the narrator has to leave. She will be leaving Monte Carlo with Mrs. Van Hopper, and it's going to be a pretty quick exit. It's pretty clear that the narrator is really tortured about this decision to leave. She doesn't want to leave Maxim on the note that she left him, but she also knows that she's not really strong enough to confront him and tell him how she really feels. And so we get a lot of that inner monologue throughout this chapter. Right at the beginning of the chapter, we do see this shift back to the present. So our narrator is back in this kind of exile state. We call this would be the present, where she's currently writing. Most of this book is a recollection of her past. So we do see this as a transitional tool that du Maurier uses in order to kind of set each chapter up. You'll see kind of the shift to the present and then her reflecting back onto her past. So just be aware of that time shifting. That is a quality that du Maurier shares with her readers, and one that you probably will need to know for your exam. So moving on, so we have the narrator, she has to leave, and she's very torn up about it. And we see the long-winded fantasies that she goes on. And these long-winded fantasies, there's actually a word for it. The tense is actually past progressive. So what she's doing is she is predicting her future, but she's also talking about her past self. So anytime we see things in the past progressive, things like I should do this, or I was going to, or something that's going to happen in the future, we see this as a fantasy of the narrator. And the narrator has lots of these fantasies. In chapter 5, we see 3 or 4 of these fantasies that last almost 2 to 3 pages each. And the thing to notice about these fantasies is when she has these fantasies, things never really go the way she thinks they're going to go. So what this shows us is that she's very paranoid. She's almost unreliable in a sense. When you see her making these predictions about the future, we can almost as readers think, all right, this isn't going to happen at all. This is never, ever, ever going to happen because she's predicting that it will happen. So I think that's something else to look out for because you're going to see it a lot. And when she makes these predictions, she's not telling us what actually happened. Generally, they are forced and end up not being true. For example, when she says, Max is going to, he's going to go back and I'm going to go to New York and, maybe he'll write me a letter and this letter will be a generic letter that he sent to everybody else. And maybe he'll add a little personal touch that's almost just as generic and it'll tear me up inside, and he'll have a new wife by then and he'll be happy and be throwing parties and all of this stuff. And obviously by the end of chapter 6, we know that none of that ended up happening or will end up happening. We also know that the narrator is together with Max de Winter in the present, right? So again, this is really helping to build the paranoia of the character, showing us how inside of her head she really is. So we have a lot of these fantasies about all of the things that could happen if she doesn't just confront Max before she leaves. She kind of hides in the bathroom and she's freaking out about having to leave. And at a certain point, she decides, you know what? I'm going to go up there. I'm going to do it. And she goes up to his room and she confronts him and says, hey, I'm leaving, just wanted you to know, and I have to leave in like 5 minutes. And Max seems very unconcerned, unbothered by this. He's like, just grab a seat, waiter, go get some food. I'm going to take a shower real quick, just wait here. And the narrator's obviously freaking out inside because she has to leave, and this might be the last time that she sees him. Again, that's kind of building up some tension. And the Max de Winter finally comes out. He's just like, hey, you have to leave, go to New York. I got to go back to Manderley. Where would you want to go? Do you want to go to Manderley? Do you want to go to New York? And this really takes the narrator aback. And she thinks he's joking at first. And he's like, no, I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool. And this is a very disingenuous proposal. I mean, I've had a pretty my proposal wasn't the greatest, most romantic thing in the world, but this definitely tops that. We have Max de Winter saying, I'm asking you to marry me, you little fool. And what I'm noticing about Max is he really talks down to the narrator. I don't think he really means a lot of harm in the things he says, but we do know that words have an effect on people. And we do know that the narrator is very inside of herself. So when he says things like this, you have to think that this is kind of fueling a lot of the inner dialogue or inner monologue that the narrator's having. A couple lines later, she says, or he says, you're almost as ignorant as Mrs. Van Hopper and just as unintelligent. Then later on he says, it's a pity you have to grow up. So there are some things that I think are a little bit concerning. He also shows her that she needs to be subservient We've talked a little bit about the roles of women, and what Max is asking of our narrator is to play that role of the housewife. And he almost is trying to sell it to her and say, you know what, you do this for Mrs. Van Hopper anyway. Why don't you just marry me and do the same job that you did for Mrs. Van Hopper, but you can do it for me. So I think that's an important highlight that we need to consider, is kind of this role of the subservient woman. Max is obviously knowing that she needs to be dependent on him, and that is kind of grounds for the territory of their marriage. Another interesting thing we see is that the narrator says, I don't know if I can do this. I don't belong in your sort of world. And I think we're seeing a divergence of ideals by the two characters. What Max wants is something different. He doesn't want someone from his own world. He wants somebody who is not Rebecca. He wants somebody who is maybe a little more young, a little more unpolished. Maybe he wants somebody who's a little more dependent and subservient, which tells us that maybe Rebecca was the opposite of this. And maybe what he wants is somebody who's much different than Rebecca. But the question is, does the narrator want that? Does the narrator want to continue to be young? Does she want to continue to be the girl that she is? Or does she have this fantasy of when she is with him, she is going to be the next queen of Manderley, or, the next Rebecca? And I think that right now we have kind of a clash of character traits, of character philosophies almost. So I see a lot of warning signs in this proposal, and I hope that you were able to pick up on some of those as well. She eventually has this fantasy. We see another one of these fantasies where she is thinking about her future at Manderley and how she's going to walk through the beautiful gardens and the sun will shine down on her and she's going to pick flowers, which is a lot different than the Manderley that we were introduced to in chapter 1. And she does end up accepting the proposal, and she is a little too cowardly to tell Van Hopper herself, so she asks Max to tell Van Hopper that she's no longer going to work for her and that the narrator will be coming back with him to Manderley. While he's doing that, we see a really juicy excerpt in the chapter, and the narrator is so scared that she's sitting in the other room while De Winter and Van Hopper are speaking, and she notices that book of poetry, and she's tempted, and this book of poetry almost represents a ghost. It's almost like Rebecca is haunting her through that book of poetry, and this should be the best moment of the narrator's life, but still there's that beating heart of the ghost of Rebecca just beating on the bed or on the table. That book of poetry is just sitting there looking at her, and what she does is she opens it up and she gets a look at that R again. She sees the name of Rebecca and she says, it was almost as if she wrote it yesterday. We see the jealousy rising and rising, and she rips out the page and she takes scissors and she starts cutting it up and tearing it up. She throws it in the trash can and she sets it on fire. Now this is, I think, pretty extreme. This is cause for concern. I think that this shows me that our narrator might not be the most stable of people, and that this is just the tip of the iceberg of her jealousy. And as the letters are burning, she notices that the R is the last thing that burns. And I think it's just a really captivating image of the burning R in the trash can underneath her. And then Max walks back in and she says, all right, I talked to her. It's all good. We can leave. And then we see a final conversation between Van Hopper and the narrator. And Van Hopper is just, she's something else. She sows a lot of doubt in the narrator's mind, is like, you know what? I don't think you can do this. I think this is a mistake. I think you're going to regret it. I think you are too awkward. You're too young. You won't be able to fill the shoes of somebody who is high status, who has the prestige of living at Manderley. I don't think you can do it. And while this is very cruel and almost damaging to the psyche of our narrator, I think it's reasonable as a reader to kind of think she's kind of right. I don't think she can either, because we're seeing the inner monologue of this character. We're seeing how her mind works, and I think that's one of the most fascinating parts of this book. Is it's a very psychological book. We really have to appreciate the fact that Du Maurier is giving us insight into a character's brain, giving us full access to the narrator's mind, of being able to see the twists and turns in the narrator's thinking. And it's almost amazing how photographic the memory is. So while I love the narrator's mind and memory, the way it's photographic and it remembers little details and objects, I think the question that it leaves us with is, how much do we trust the narrator? Is the narrator reliable? And I think it's just something to tuck in the back of your head. I'm not saying, oh, we should just not trust the narrator, but it's just something to be thinking about. We know that her idea of Manderley is much different than the Manderley that we were seeing in chapter 1. So I just think it's a complex narrator, and that's something to appreciate about the book. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me or any one of your teachers. If you want some more guidance, if you have questions about anything that happened in this chapter, please let us know, and I'll see you guys for chapter 7. See ya.